Okay, good morning, everybody. I am so excited to continue our sphere project today. Just make sure on our channel, make sure to like and follow us so you don't miss any of our future lessons. My name is Mandy Tice. I'm the director of the School of Atelier Arts, and this is episode 3 of learning how to to paint a sphere en grisaille, which means painting a sphere in black and white. So what we're going today wow, I haven't had my coffee or enough of it apparently. So what we're going to do today is we are going to actually put some of the paint that we mixed yesterday onto our canvas. You may recall in our first episode, we learned how to kind of block in our drawing to give us an opportunity to think about some of the key elements of our painting before we even put paint on canvas. So I'm just going to review briefly episode 1 and episode 2, and then we're going to jump into episode 3. If you're just joining us, please say hello. Let me know how you're doing. Let me know where you're from. And I just love seeing the messages from all of you and getting that feedback from you. So good morning to Marguerite and good morning, Peter. So happy to see you. Okay. Okay, so just briefly a review. In episode 1, we blocked in. We decided the placement of where our sphere was going to be on the canvas. We talked about ground planes, back planes, and front planes, and we talked about ellipses, how a sphere, when it collapses, becomes an ellipse. So this is what we did in episode 1. Episode 2, we started mixing up a palette. Now, you can mix a 9-string palette or a 5-string palette or even a 3-string palette. Yesterday in episode 2, we mixed a 5-string palette. So I'm going to show that to you. Okay, so I'm still learning how cameras work. So you can see here, actually, I'll do it like this. You can see here that we have our white, our black, our middle value, a middle light, and a middle dark. So we did a 5-step palette. Now, while we were mixing, we mixed up some, off colors or mixed up too much of something, and I just kind of threw it on the side. Those are useful for coming back. So I have a question in the chat. What size canvas am I using? So this canvas is an 8 by 10. This is an 8 by 10 canvas. I had to think for a minute there. So you don't need a huge canvas for this project because what we're painting itself is not that big. The light bulb that I spray painted white that I talked about in episode 1, that's maybe 5 inches in diameter. So, you don't need to have a giant canvas with tons of background on it and then a 5-inch sphere. So you want to make sure that your canvas is proportionate to the subject that you are painting. Okay, so a little bit of theory. So the sphere painting, it's a combination of observation, like what we're actually looking at, that spray painted sphere, and theory. So I want to talk a little bit about how light works when you're looking at a background. Um, and I have a question about what kind of palette I'm using. I'm using a wood palette. So with the different palettes, like, people ask me all the time, oh, a glass palette, oh, a wood palette, oh, a palette that clips to your easel, one you hold in your hand, one that's in front of you on a table. Um, you know, I don't think it matters all that much, but I personally prefer a wood palette. I like my palettes on the thinner side. The thinner I can find them, the better. And I like holding my palette when I paint. I don't know. I just always enjoyed the romanticism of holding my palette when I paint. When I'm giving classes online like this, I tend to hold it up more next to my paintings so that you guys can see. But if I'm painting just for me, I like to have it on my arm. All right. So what do I think about a plastic palette? The plastic palettes, the main problem, in my opinion, with plastic palettes is that they easily gouge when you're using your palette knife on them, and those scratches don't heal. And the difference between the plastic palette and the wood palette is, yes, you're still going to gouge your wood palette on occasion, but every time you put paint on your palette and every time you wipe it off, it leaves a little bit of a veneer of the paint from that day on your palette, and that builds up over time and it actually heals the scratches, and a wood palette gets better over time, whereas a plastic palette only gets worse over time. So that's my opinion. Like, sure, if that's what you have, don't let it, use what you have. Don't let it stop you from painting. But if I were at the store and I was like, which palette should I get? Definitely wood. And in my opinion, that's a strong preference of mine. But I also don't want people getting so distracted by materials that they just don't start painting. Sometimes when we obsess over materials, it's because we're scared to do the painting part, right? And so it feels like we're, doing something important in making progress in our art, but we're really just, spinning our wheels. So if you are starting from scratch and you just want to know, get the wood palette. But if you have a plastic or a glass or any other kind of palette, just paint. Just paint. And then eventually, if you want to get a different palette, fine. But don't let that be the excuse that you don't paint today. Um, and hello, Irene from Northern New Jersey. And thank you so much. I'm glad that you're enjoying these live streams. Okay, so another way to mix paint, you can use wax paper, but it tends to tear, and I have a problem making a mess. So for me, wood palette, that's my jam. Okay, so I'm just gonna like huff on my coffee for 1 second, and then we're going to paint these backgrounds here. Okay. I'm going to do some theory and talking about, the theory behind what we're seeing and combine that with the observation of what we're seeing. And then we're going to put paint to canvas. But I promise we're going to get paint on canvas today, even if it's just a little bit. But there's just so much. People sit down and they see a sphere and they're like, oh, I can do that. No problem. Right. But to paint a sphere really well is actually an extraordinary intellectual exercise. And my goal for this class for all of you is that, even if you're still in the practicing stage of your art, that you start understanding the theory and you raise the bar of where you're trying to go, at least one more notch, right? So that's my goal for you with this project. And hello from Pennsylvania, Ellen. Okay. I'm going to rotate. Excuse me, I'm still fighting that cold. Excuse cold. Okay, so when I am looking at this sphere, my light source is coming from this direction, from above and to the left, and it is hitting my sphere here, and then it's wrapping around my sphere in all directions. And then there's an exact point where my shadow my light turns to shadow rather here. Now we can talk a lot about the types of light on the sphere, and we will when it's time to paint the sphere. But what I want you to point out, wow, Mandy, is just words are hard this morning. What I want to point out to you is that by being aware of our direction, we can get better ideas of what's going on in the environment of our sphere. A lot of people think, oh, I'm painting a sphere. I only need to worry about painting the sphere. But the environment will make or break your painting. You can have a beautifully rendered sphere on your canvas, and if you do not have the same level of nuance and observation in your background, it's going to look like a cartoon. All right. So tell me in the chat, has anybody here like been really inspired to sit down and paint something and you work really hard on it and it's kind of like this battle, and then at the end, it just feels like a little cartoony and you don't know why? If that's happened to you, I want to hear your stories in the chat. We are not alone, people. We are all fighting these demons. Okay. So if that's happened to you, I find that when I'm teaching in my online atelier painting bootcamp, that oftentimes the reason that something's looking a little cartoony often has to do with the fact that the background was not treated at the same level as the subject. So we're going to start with the background today because it's so important, and we're going to revere background painting before the end of class today, and certainly by the end of this entire project. Okay, so back to light. Just a tiny bit of a review of what the sphere is sitting on. We call this a ground plane. This back here is the back plane. And this little ledge, where this light is breaking from the top to this front plane, we call this the front plane. So front plane, ground plane, back plane. So those are the words I'm going to be using as I describe what we're doing here today. And yes, I see some people in the chat being like, that thing that you just said about it feeling cartoony in the end, that's happened to me. It's happened to all of us because we're all learning how to paint, right? And the hardship about learning atelier training, really learning how to paint, is that some areas in your skill set are going to become more refined before other areas. And it can be really frustrating as a student because you of course want to sit down and make the perfect, most beautiful painting every time. That's a frustration that we all face. And it's not just students. I'm a professional painter at this point in my career, and I still agonize sometimes about one area of my painting not being the same level of sophistication as the rest. So by developing good painting habits, we hope to avoid this problem. All right. So there is essentially a rule about light. It's a generalized rule, but if you know it, it'll help you see better. So this is going to seem so obvious, but the closer something is to the light source, the lighter it's going to be. The further away from a light source, the darker it's going to be. And that's a pretty simple concept. I'm going to say it one more time. It's just so simple, and I want you to get it in your head. This is our guiding star. This is our North Star, that the closer something is to the light source, the lighter it's going to be. The further away from a light source, the darker it's going to be. So let's take a look at our sphere and our backgrounds, especially the background. All right. We essentially have gradients here. So for example, if I'm looking at the ground plane, the front of the ground plane is brighter because it's closer to my light source. But as it goes back in space here, the ground plane goes back in space, it gets darker because this part is further away from the light source than the very front part of the ground plane. All right. So the further something is away from the light source, the darker it's going to be. The closer it is to the light source, the lighter it's going to be. The same is true from left to right. This left part of my ground plane is closer to my light source and therefore brighter. And as the light travels further and further from the light source, it's going to get darker. So even though this is the front and this is the front, the left side of the front is going to be brighter than the right side of the front because the left side of the front is closer than the right side, and the front is closer than further back. All right. Now there is one more element going on here. My sphere is in a shadow box. So even though this part over here is closer physically to my light source, this box is blocking the light. It's interrupting the light and creating a diagonal break here between the light and the shadow. So this side of my box, it's casting a shadow down here. So that's why this part is so dark, even though this is closer to the light source than this, right? But this part doesn't have a cast shadow back here in this corner. This side does have a cast shadow from this edge of the box. Excuse me. And great. I'm glad I see some comments in the chat like, oh, I knew front to back it's light to dark, but I hadn't thought about it going from left to right. And that's so true. And I see this with students all the time, that they're not making that consideration of which part is closest to the light source, right? And that's why I try to give big generalized ideas that we can then refine. So we know that this is closer to the light source than that. So this has to be brighter than that. Okay, so this is our generalized rule for what we're doing today. But that's also why backgrounds are so gradient heavy. So when I say gradients, we often think of, I don't know, we often don't think of gradients when we're painting, but that's essentially what most planes do, because you have, oh, did I just paint on my, oops. It's what most planes do, because you have a big flat plane that's gradually getting darker as it goes one way and gradually getting darker as it goes the other way, and it's creating a double gradient. All right. So what are we going to do about this? So we have this back plane, the ground plane, and the front plane. If you're ever not sure where to start with the biggest and work to the smallest. So let me know in the chat, which is my biggest plane on my canvas? Is it this back plane, the ground plane, or the front plane? Which one would you say is the largest? Back plane, ground plane, front plane? We talked about this yesterday, but The best way to learn is to get feedback from an Atelier trained instructor. And the best way for me to give you feedback in this live stream is for you guys to eat your vegetables. And I know nobody wants to like sit and type necessarily, but by putting your guesses down, you're actually going to improve your learning outcomes in this format. So I strongly, strongly encourage you, if you're sitting there with your arms crossed being like, I'm not going to type, I strongly encourage you to give it the guess because it's going to enhance your learning experience, by committing to an answer, even if you're wrong, it's going to help you see and learn more in this class because it's really the only way that I can correct you and give you that direct feedback in a stream-like class. Now, in our online Atelier painting bootcamp, you get me on a Zoom call, right, back and forth, and you get the direct feedback that way. But in this more mass setting, the best thing you can do is answer questions in the chat. It'll enhance your learning. Okay, and I see lots of participation, lots of vegetable eating in the chat. Thank you. And I see all correct answers. That this background is the largest area. So we're going to start big to small. So this is the biggest area of my painting here. Good vegetable eating, everybody. Okay. Please forgive my cold. All right. So now this background's a little tricky. If I didn't have this side of the box casting a shadow here, then it wouldn't be changing my background all that much. But even that being said, I can see that generally speaking, it's doing the opposite because of this cast shadow, that because of this cast shadow, over here is actually the lightest because it's not getting as much light blocked as this part. So even though it's the exact opposite of what I just said, the reason it's lighter over here is because of this cast shadow. So we actually have a gradient that's going from dark to light this way and dark to light from top to bottom, because the further away from the light source, the more of it is sneaking into the very, very back of our box. So it's actually the complete reverse of how light works everywhere else. All right. So what I want to do is create a gradient where it's darkest here, lightest here, and I essentially have a pretty consistent, smooth transition from that dark upper left to the lightest bottom right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask myself, and here's where you're going to eat your vegetables again. So I'm going to ask myself, and I'm going to ask you, this upper corner here, if you had to give it a value from 1 to 9, where 1 is white and 9 is black, what value on a 1 to 9 scale do you think the upper left corner is in this painting? Is it a pure black? Is it a 9? Is it a pure white? Is it a 1? Is it somewhere in between? Is it closer to black or closer to white? So give me a number from 1 to 9 where 9 is black, 1 is white. What do you think this upper left corner is? Give it a number. And I see some brave people already typing in the chat. Excellent. So I'm going to give you guys a second to get your numbers typed in there. And I already see some really good guesses. All right. So I see some people giving me some 5s. I see some 7s. I see some 8s. I see some 5s question mark. Awesome for putting it down. And it's fine. Like, we're learning here. And this is actually what Atelier training under an instructor that knows more than you can do, is that you put your best guess out there and then I help you see it better. All right. So let's go through the thought process. If we have 1 through 9, we know it's somewhere in between. We know it's not a pure black. We know it's not a pure white. So then the next question we want to ask ourselves is it closer to black or is it closer to white? And I would say that this is darker than the halfway point. So those of you putting 5s out there, not a terrible guess, but 5 is a little bit light because this is sitting a little bit on the darker side of 5 than the lighter side of 5. So I would say somewhere maybe 6, 7, somewhere in between there. And it's okay if you guessed wrong, right? Like, nobody cares that you guessed wrong, but I care a whole lot that you can see the thought process and the learning process for seeing it a little bit better next time. right? So thank you for being brave. Thank you for putting yourselves out there. And thanks for learning with me because I'm going to turn this because this is really important. It takes an insane amount of bravery to learn how to paint at the highest levels. If you want to be an atelier trained artist, you have to be brave. And all those people typing in the chat right now, very brave. You're going to make it. You're going to be fine. So thank you for your bravery. All right, so I'd say like a 6.5, maybe even a 7. So I'm going to put that guess down on my canvas here. Let me rotate back so you can see the, oops, I just dropped something. Give me a second. So some of you, I know I mentioned this, but I'm new to live streaming, so I'm doing something scary, right? I'm putting myself out there in a new way. So I'm trying not to make you be brave on your own, but I'm still like adjusting my setup, trying to figure out what works, what doesn't, because I find that I'm really intimidated by technology. And some of you, especially if you were following me on my old channel, the Da Vinci Initiative, I didn't post anything for years because I got overwhelmed by all the tech, right? And when live streaming came out, and I'm like, you mean I can just push a button and then teach and then end the button and then not do the editing part? It brought me back. So I'm still trying to learn my new systems, and I appreciate you being here to learn along with me. So there's a good question in the chat about value scales. Is it an absolute scale or a relative scale? And we are going to go on a severe side quest to answer that question that I don't want to go on right now. But I will briefly state that the scale is relative to your materials. So painting, when you use oil paint, the black, it can get a darker value than say you're using a graphite pencil. So a 9 for a graphite pencil is as dark as it can go, but that might be only a 7 in oil painting scale, right? Because the graphite can't get as dark as the oil paint. I don't want to confuse everybody with an esoteric question like that right now, but if you send me an email, I'll make a little video just about relative. If you just send me an email to remind me, I'll make a little mini side video on that. But I don't want to go on the safari right now. We have too much to do today. All right. So I am guessing, we said 6-ish, somewhere between 6 and 7, maybe up here. So I'm going to take my 7 and just put a mark down and see how I feel. So remember, we did a 5-step palette. So what I have here is my 1, my 9, my 5, 7, and 3. So I'm guessing a 7. So I'm just going to put my 7 down there and see how I feel about it. Also, so your brushes, try to get a higher quality brush only because you don't want bristles falling in your paint all the time. And then also when you're painting, make sure that you're painting with a brush size that's proportionate to the space that you want. You don't want a tiny little brush like this. Students do this to me all the time. They get this tiny little brush. They're going to fill in this whole background with this tiny, tiny little brush, right? Don't do that. Right. So what we need is a brush proportionate to the space here. All right. So I'm going to get some of my 7, and I'm just going to put a note down. Now, we did not do an underpainting for this, okay? And so what that means is any paint that we put on this canvas is going to look crazy dark just because it's on a white canvas. So when you put your first note down, my first thought is, that looks way too dark, right? But we don't really know until we get a good portion of the canvas covered how accurate it really is. We're just giving our best theoretical idea. Now, if you're interested in learning underpainting, I cover that extensively in our online atelier bootcamp, and you can learn more about that at School of Atelier Arts. That's not the technique we're using for this particular project, but it is a wonderful kind of way to baby step. If what I'm about to do feels like too far, too much, too fast, and underpainting is kind of an in-between step between the drawing and what I'm doing today. So if you feel like, oh, I can't just go in and throw a note down, an underpainting might be for you. Okay, so I put it down, but I also want to evaluate. So I'm going to rotate you back. I want to evaluate how I actually feel about it. So when you're trying to evaluate, you need a big enough area painted that you can really see the note. And then I'm squinting my eyes and I'm comparing it to the value over there. So this is my 7 on my palette. It's feeling a little bit dark, but I also know that, this gradient is going to go from dark to light this way and dark to light that way. So as I put my gradient in, it's going to start to feel lighter because it has to transition all the way from this note to this note. So I have my first idea. It's an okay guess. I don't want to change it too much because I don't know how much I'm being affected by the white canvas versus how accurate this particular value is. But if I want to know how close I am, I can get my next value where I'm going. So you want the note of where you're starting in a gradient and a note of where you're going in a gradient, and then you work back in between the two. So we know that it's darkest and getting slightly lighter here, although not very much. It's mostly getting lighter this way and lighter, especially down here in this corner because of the way light works. So now that I'm down here, I need to figure out what paint note is in this corner. Now, it's not a pure black, it's not a pure white, it's somewhere in between. But the question is, is this corner down here lighter than halfway, at the halfway, or darker than the halfway point? And so it's time, my friends, for your guesses. So I'm asking you this bottom corner area here, on a scale from 1 to 9, what value, with 1 being white and 9 being black, would you give the bottom right corner? So be brave. I'm looking forward to your answers. I'm going to have a sip of coffee here and try to stop coughing on you. Okay. Good, brave people out there in the world. Okay, I'm getting 4s and 5s. These are excellent guesses. Now, I feel like it's maybe a 5, personally. Like maybe a tiny bit lighter than 5, maybe a 4.5. But my gut tells me it's kind of close to 5. So I'm gonna put some 5 down here. Ooh, and that's feeling a little dark too. But again, is it feeling dark because it's surrounded by white canvas, or is it feeling dark because it's a little too dark? But to me, I think that color note was off. I think you guys were more right than me. I think it's a 4. So I'm going to pull. I don't have a 4 on my palette, so I'm going to mix between my 3 and my 5 here to get a 4. Now, when you're making an adjustment like I'm making, because I originally put a 5 down, it's going to pull up some of the paint underneath. So sometimes you have to overshoot the lightness to get, because it's mixing with what's underneath it a little bit. So I'm going to overshoot the lightness just a touch here. And I think I really need to overshoot it. It's, that dark is just consuming so much of my white here. So this is called mixing on canvas. I generally encourage students to mix on a palette, but with backgrounds, when you're making adjustments and working gradients, you're often doing mixing on the background itself. All right, so I'm asking myself, how do I feel about that? And that's feeling okay. It might be a little bit dark, but it might not. Remember that we still have to save our lightest lights for this front part of our ground plane, and it also has to have room to go dark as it goes back in space there. So I think that that's probably okay for what we're doing right now. Okay, so what I want to do now, and let me rotate this so that you guys can see a little better. All right, so what I want to do now is basically connect these two values. And the general idea is that as it goes across, it's going to get a little bit lighter, and as it goes down, it's going to get a little bit lighter. You can work from the light into the dark or the dark into the light. Because I feel like I might be a touch on the dark side, I'm going to work from the light side towards the dark because that'll skew it slightly lighter. Okay, so all right, now one thing to think about as we get close to the sphere, remember on day one, how I said that this circle is sacred, and if you mess with it or touch it or mess it up, that you immediately need to correct it. The absolutely hardest thing for students to do when they are painting a sphere is to maintain the circle, right? So maintaining the drawing even as it's being covered in paint. So as you're doing your background and as you're sneaking up on this edge, it is absolutely imperative that you are so careful. You can even switch to a smaller brush. You know, this brush isn't giving me a very good edge on it, so I'm only going to get close to the sphere right now, and I'm not going to touch that sphere until I transition to a smaller brush. Okay, so we said that it's going from light to dark. I'm also using this basket weaving technique, just trying to make my brush strokes go in all directions here. How do I feel? I still feel okay about that value, actually. All right, but it does need to get a little darker as it goes across the top, and then as it goes across our canvas here, again, I'm being very careful around the sphere. I'm going to get a smaller brush before I go anywhere near the edge of that sphere. All right, so far I'm mostly using one color. It's a little bit lighter down here than it is up here, but what's going to happen is I'm going to start hitting soon this this darker area, and we're going to start creating our gradient. So again, you can work from light to dark or dark to light, just depending on whether you feel like overall you went too light or too dark. But do you see how I pulled into that dark and now I'm going back across my page, kind of building that gradient across. All right, so I'm going to wipe my brush clean and I'm going to start with my darker color. And I'm going to start with that dark and work my way across here. And I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to wipe my brush, start in the dark and work towards the light. And we're just building up that gradient. And, you know, it's a really subtle gradient on this particular thing. And also keep in mind that the top is a little bit darker than the bottom, right? So the gradient goes in two directions. It's going from dark to light this way, and it's also going from dark to light this way. But it's quite subtle how it's being done. Again, cleaning my brush off, starting on my dark side, working across here. You know, a lot of people are so negligent of their backgrounds. They don't give it the same nuance as the rest of the painting. And that's a mistake. That's going to ruin your whole painting. You know, it's not just a painting about a sphere. It's a painting about a sphere in an environment. All right, so I'm standing back, taking a look at that, feeling pretty good. So now I'm going to work from here down, and the same thing, it gets a tiny bit darker as it gets down here. Not too much. It's just that, remember that the side here is casting a shadow, and the closer the shadow is to the edge, the slightly darker it is, which is why back here is going to be a little bit darker. Oops, that's probably way too much of a difference. All right, so I put a bad note down, so I'm just trying to go back a little bit, but now I overcorrected it too light. The key is not to panic. Like, okay, you put a wrong note down, no biggie, but be methodical about how you correct it, because when you put a wrong note down, that's when students start panicking, and then they start like, "Wah!" You're just smushing paint around. So try not to panic. So and okay, a couple notes. Yes, the light is changing. I'm using a natural light, and we just had like a big sun situation come out. It's especially bad because I have some double doors behind me that, even though they don't have a direct access to my shadow box, that they allow a lot of light in. So I actually have some screens that I'm going to put up here in a minute to get us closer to where our light situation was a minute ago. Another great comment in the chat: why wipe the brush? So if I was working over here and I jump over here, I'm going to pull this color into here. Whereas if I want a really smooth, even transition, if I wipe my brush, get the color back, and then, work from it, then it's not creating these like swirls of paint in my background. It's just a way to get a more even transition. So I'm going to get close here, and then I'm going to put my screen up because that light just got crazy. This is also a new studio for me, so I'm still kind of learning the systems. In my online class, I talk a lot about how to set up a studio. I actually exclusively go through how I set up this studio, where the light is, why the light is where it is. But every space that you're in is so, so different. So I live in the middle of the woods, and in the fall, so there's trees all above my light source here. And in the fall, we had this brilliant orange fall in the Northeast. It was crazy, right? Like, it was the most brilliantly colored fall I'd ever seen. And all of a sudden, there was like 1 week where the tree right over my window was at pure red, and it was tinting everything that I was painting, right? It was bouncing so much red light in just from the outside trees. And it's not something you necessarily think about in your studio, but you want to be mindful and asking yourself, is this the same? What's the light doing? Is the light doing the same thing now as it was doing 5 minutes ago? So that's a great comment there. Okay, so I need to do two things now. One, I need to get a smaller brush and be really, really careful about getting the edge all the way to my sphere without losing my sphere drawing. And the other thing I need to do is to block out that light. So I'm going to just take a 30-second timeout here and get those screens going. I'll turn this so you can contemplate this, and then after I get the screens up, we're going to start edging our background into the edge of the sphere. Okay, so we're starting to get the light under control. I might need one more screen. Okay, we're starting to get things under control here. There's a reason why when you go to different ateliers that they have all sorts of curtains that they're pulling this way, that way. Trying to control your light is an endless task for the artist, and being mindful of it. Sometimes students don't know that the light changed. They don't catch it right away. And then they start painting their project with one kind of light, and then the light changes and they start changing their whole painting. I love painting from natural light personally. I get great joy out of it. I just love kind of that direct connection to nature. But there's a reason that a lot of ateliers start students with a spotlight instead of natural light. So if you find that you are getting really frustrated by light changing, I encourage you to go to like a little lamp that directly shines light onto your sphere. Okay. Um, all right. So now I'm going to work on, let me rotate you back so you guys get the good view. Um, oh, Peter saying, yes, the joys of plein air. It's so true. Plein air painting is especially well known for changing light. Okay, so I'm just going to push my paint very carefully towards the edge of my sphere. You do not want to lose the drawing of your sphere. I cannot emphasize this enough. It's very, very important that you do not lose the edge of your sphere. Go slow so that you can finish fast. If you lose the edge of the sphere, redraw it immediately. And I very ever so slightly over. All right, it's worth going so slow for. Take your time, put on your podcast. Do not lose the edge of the sphere. All right, so we're just slowly working our way around. Now's a good time to ask yourself those like life questions like, who am I? What do I do? What's my purpose in life? All the things. And I see a comment in the chat. Every time I've tried to do something like this, I lose the edge and the subject grew in size and I tried to fix it. Yes, yes. People don't realize that, I mean, refinding a drawing is its own skill, but also never losing the drawing in the first place is its own skill. Um, Oh, so here's a good question from Peter. So Peter's asking me, you have to do the same thing when I start painting the sphere, right? So why not just do the extra care painting of the circumference just once? And the reason is that as soon as you lose the circumference, especially in a sphere, if you lose the perfectness of the circle, it's so hard to get it back. It's worth being really careful, both from the outside in and the inside out. uh, so many people are like, and tell me in the chat, tell me if this is you, like you're painting and you're like, oh, that's good enough, right? Like, it's not quite right, but you run out of ideas of how to make it. And atelier training is about stopping that mindset, being like, no, I'm going to figure out how to do it the right way. And often in order to make that jump, you can't just sit in your studio alone. If you want to be a better painter, if you know that something isn't right, you need to acknowledge and own that something isn't right. And if you don't know how to fix it, you need to take that next step of having an instructor in your life that can help you. Like there's no reason to stall in your artwork, and really investing in your training, like you all are investing in your training right now. When you learn these skills, you have it for the whole rest of your life, right? Your entire rest of your painting career. I often think about going to school or going to an atelier, like saving for retirement really early, right? That compound interest over the rest of your life of learning these skills all at once instead of trying to dabble it out through 5, 10, 15 years. That's 5, 10, or 15 years that you can paint at your best level, that you can be your best painter self, if you really just invest in the training. And I know it's hard. Like, I went back to waitressing, from having a professional career to get my atelier training. And um, I know it's an investment. I know it's hard, but if you really want to learn how to paint at the highest levels, there's no reason to try to do it all on your own, over decades, when someone can teach you what you're yearning to know in a year or two. That's just my 2 cents. Okay. So this is just the slow, steady part of our day here. Now, um, because of the technology set up here, I'm really trying to wedge myself into this space. So you might see me do some funny moves here. But if you are ready to start your atelier training or level up your atelier training, it's great that you're here. This is amazing. You're getting some feedback, especially those of you who are really active in the chat. That's wonderful. But imagine if you could accelerate your learning, even beyond that. And that's what we teach in the boot camp. You have access to me 2 times a week in our online class. We have a great group of people in there. I think some of them are here today if you want to say hello. And you're getting critiques from me to help you solve your very specific problems. And often the problems that students think that they're having are not actually what their problems are, right? Sometimes people will come to me and be like, I just don't know how to draw eyes. I just really want to know how to draw eyes. Well, the problem with their portraits wasn't their eyes. The problem with their portraits was the shape of the head, but it felt to them that it was the eye, right? And that's the advantage of atelier instruction, is that it helps you make sure that you're working on the right problems. And it's very personalized. Everybody works on their own projects at their own pace. I have some students that work, hours every day in their studio, and I have some students that only have about 15 minutes a day, but they're all making progress. I'm really proud of my boot camp students. If you're here, know that I'm proud of you. Um, oh, so here's a great question. What do you do if you do accidentally overpaint the edge? You can put a little bit of Gamasol on a napkin, and I'd make a corner here, and you can push out from the inside. So there's a couple areas where I could, where I had one hair of my brush go over, so I might go back and push that out, but um, just correct it. The best thing I can say is correct it best you can. So if the Gamasol doesn't pull it out, get a clean brush, get a little bit of white paint, and just put a little bit of white paint there just to reestablish the edge. Because if you lose the edge, it's sad. You'll be bad news bears. It'll be a very aggravating and frustrating painting journey for the whole rest of the painting. So if you really lose your edge just by painting the background, it is absolutely worth starting over, because if you cannot refine your edge, it's going to just create a nightmare scenario for you for the rest of the painting. Um, Oh, and McCree's put something really nice in there. McCree's one of our boot camp students, and she's doing really well. I'm proud of you, McCree. Oh, all right. So, just being slow and steady here, getting through things. I'm starting to realize that we're not going to get through the entire background today. This is going to end up being a 2-day situation. So we'll finish up this part here, and tomorrow we'll start working on the ground plane. Also in our boot camp, I try really hard to support our students, so I don't just teach you how to paint, I teach you how to run a newsletter, how to sell your artwork, things like that. And I also promote my students a lot through my own channels. So those are some more advantages of training with me. So I hope you guys will consider it. All right. Okay, so I'm not going to worry about this ground plane too much because we're going to have some back and forth. But I do have this glob of paint here that I don't want to dry as a glob of paint. It was just kind of messy right there. All right. Okay. So we are going to call that for today. Tomorrow we'll continue working on the ground plane and the front plane. So um, that's what we're going to continue on with. So, are there any questions for today? Anything that surprised you about painting backgrounds? And let me know in the chat what's helpful to you. What would you like to see more of? I am new to this, and my goal is to provide you the best education that I can. And so, any feedback you have for me to help you have a better learning experience, I want to hear that as well. So. Um, thank you all for joining me for painting. It's so nice to wake up, paint, and have all these friends around to paint with. It's wonderful. Lovely seeing all of you, and I hope to see you again tomorrow as we continue this project. Bye, everybody.